I'm not entirely sure where this idea came from, but it's been something that's been floating around in my mind for the better part of a decade. It basically was, yeah, just a moment in time for me where I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we had like 1,000-year-old trees dotted throughout the city, and what would that look like? And that was just kind of floating around in the background, thinking about what kinds of species those trees might be, where would you plant them, how would you tend them, how would you keep them from being cut down or vandalized. And to be honest, after a decade of thinking about that, I don't have all of the answers, except that I know that thinking about these things, for whatever reason, brings me a lot of joy. And fortunately, I've been able to connect with lots of folks, some of you in here tonight, who have also thought that this was an interesting experiment that is worth pursuing. And so, what I like about it, um, personally for me, is it's a little bit provocative. Like when you say, "Hey, we're a group of people and we want to grow 1,000-year-old trees." I unfortunately, like a lot of the times, the response is like, like, are we going to be here in 1,000 years? And so we have this kind of like very doom and gloom dystopian sort of vision of the future. And what I like about this project is it intentionally pushes against that. It says, hey, not only do we have a future, but it could be really interesting. It could be more abundant than the present. We could be thriving. It could be filled with like 1,000-year-old beings that, we tend, and that, maybe in their own way tend us. And it sort of speaks to a partnership between like the city and society and the natural world that maybe is lacking here, and certainly is lacking in this kind of vision of tomorrow that we often talk about. So first and foremost, for me, I find this idea of planting 1,000-year-old trees to be this somewhat provocative, very hopeful exercise, and an exercise in long-term thinking, in this idea that that we can make decisions today that make the future better. How many science fiction books or movies have basically the premise of going into the past to fix some kind of wrong to make the present better? Well, we're living in somebody's future, probably the future of millions of people, and maybe we don't have the luxury of hindsight. But what kinds of things can we do today that will hopefully, increase opportunities for folks in the future? And there's this interesting kind of relay race that is required for, very slow relay race that is required for, to do something that is incredibly like long term. And so there's an interesting challenge there that I think is worth exploring. And it's a project, it's a project that obviously is going to take time. To grow 1,000-year-old tree is going to take at least 1,000 years, probably longer as we learn and make mistakes. But that's part of I think the experiment. I think that's part of, like one of the things I've really got from this is, or I'm starting to understand, is that growing 1,000-year-old trees is less about sticking trees in the ground that have the potential of living 1,000 years. And it's more about like, how do you create the conditions, or how do you create the kind of culture, the kind of communities that would care about 1,000-year-old trees? Or how do you create the kind of cultures and communities that, um, tend the future? And I also think too, like it would be silly to not point out the fact that we are surrounded by traditional cultures who have been practicing long-term thinking for thousands of years. And so maybe this is like me or us coming to this a little bit late in the game, but it's an interesting thought experiment. The future doesn't have to be bleak. It is if the future itself is a metaphorical tree with branching possibilities, how can we choose the branches? How can we cultivate the branches that are going to lead to abundance and interest, or like an interesting, abundant future that we would want, our ancestors to not our ancestors, our descendants to live in, um, going in the other direction. So I guess another way of asking this is, how do we be good ancestors? And that's a much more important question than how do you plant 1,000-year-old tree, but how do you plant 1,000-year-old tree might be an interesting exercise in tackling some of those broader questions. So we have been meeting as a group for about a year now, having these, weird philosophical conversations about what it would mean to grow really long-lived trees. We've acquired some seeds. These are all bristlecone pines, Rocky Mountain bristlecone pine, Pinus aristata. And we've been growing out little trees and distributing them. And having these conversations about, like how do we scale this up? How do we get more people involved? And it seems to us that community leagues are this fantastic resource that Edmonton is so blessed to have. We have these community organizations that are embedded within the city. And in terms of, people invested in place, um, I think community leagues have that in spades, and so it made sense to reach out to EFCL to start having some conversations about what would it look like to, get community leagues involved on the ground, and that has led to lots of really great conversations with Aaron, who is, I think, still here, coming to us from from the, I don't know, the open ocean somewhere. Uh,
Hi everyone.
Hey,
I
Aaron,
am I am here.
you caught the ferry?
I am at the ferry terminal, so I've
Okay.
got time and we're all good. Yeah, it's a little loud, but yeah, I'm
Okay.
managing.
Well, you're coming in nice and clear.
Awesome.
So, another nice thing about this project is it does fit in really well with a lot of the goals set out by the city of Edmonton. To name a couple in the Edmonton's city plan, which is our municipal development plan. There is a goal of planting 2 million trees. We also have a goal of having a 20% forest canopy coverage in the city of Edmonton. There are all kinds of ways that this connects to our breathe strategy, our ribbon of green strategy. And so it's a really kind of nice aspect of this project is that it does align up very well with a lot of the city's strategic plans, which also means that we've been able to tap into the expertise of folks like Yolanda, who's on the call today, to be able to talk about how we might do some of this. We've been heavily looking at Rocky Mountain bristlecone pine, Pinus aristata. It is native to the Rocky Mountains further south, though, in like New Mexico and Colorado. It does very well here, which I don't know if that's a I don't know if it's helpful or not to realize that our climate is very similar to the top of a mountain in Colorado. Um, but it's a very slow growing tree. Um, or as Jared Farmer, who wrote a magnificent book on long-lived trees, would put it, it's a very slow dying tree. So it can almost completely die, but if there's a little bit of life left in it, it will keep going. There's examples of these trees being many thousands of years old, and they do quite well with our climate. It's also been identified as a tree that is likely to do better as our climate continues to shift in the direction that we think it's going to shift. So, as an example, it's fairly drought tolerant. It is okay with crazy heat and it is okay with crazy cold. Uh, Pretty slow growing, but pretty tough. Another tree that we've been growing some of, and have been playing around with is ginkgo biloba. So you could say native to China or native to North America, depending on how long your time horizon is. It was once present on the continent until it went extinct on this part of the world. Slow growing tree. It is an evergreen, despite the fact, sorry, it is a conifer, despite the fact that it has what looks like leaves. Um, it is clonal, which means it can send up suckers. And on really, really old ones, they'll actually send down growths from their branches that will reach down and root like a banyan tree on extremely old trees. One that I've been like personally looking at, which I've never seen here in the city, so maybe not suitable, are yews, like a specifically a European yew. Very long-lived trees, very hard to date because as yews grow, their middles tend to rot out. And another interesting one to actually think about is a native species. So a trembling aspen, which we don't think of at all as a long-lived species because each individual trunk itself actually only lives, maybe a few decades. But as a clone, it can turn into this big giant underground subterranean thing that keeps shooting out suckers, which also makes it maybe a little bit challenging for an urban environment. But I wanted to throw it out there just because I think that there might be like an interesting possibility to play around with that species some. So we've had a lot of conversations about how we might do this. And so we've been thinking about how we might bring this idea of growing long-lived trees to community leagues. And certainly one way that we could do it is to show up with a tree and say, hey, plant this tree somewhere. There are some challenges with that. One is these trees, there are some in this picture here, believe it or not, are very slow growing. These are bristlecone pines. And even after 5 years, we're talking about a tree that is like 6 to 8 inches. And um, a lot of the requirements for planting in the city of Edmonton, like on public property, is that the tree must be of a certain size. And so for conifers, it's 2.5 meters. And so to just take a tree and stick it in the park somewhere becomes challenging because we have these really tiny trees. Now they could be grown off-site somewhere for a few decades until they reach that point, and then they could be moved. But we think that we've come up with an interesting idea that would enable us to grow trees on site while giving them time to mature before planting them when they reach size. And the way that we think we can do that is by creating little small mini nurseries. And so this is us as members of the LongTree Society. We've piloted this nursery just a little over a week ago. And so it's made out of a single piece, like a 1 by 6, 8 foot long board of cedar that's been cut into 4 pieces and assembled into a little box. Um, the box here has been filled with soil and then it's been planted with trees. Some of these trees, like we actually have little seedlings here, but we also direct seeded some seeds in there. And so there's probably around 20 little trees in there in total if they all germinate. Now, the nice thing about this here is it is planting, so it's planting a little nursery. It's not planting a tree. And so the rules are slightly different. It was also suggested that these beds here, you can see our tiny little trees. These beds here we could actually treat as shrub beds. And so I'm going to skip that slide for a second. And so the community leagues, the Edmonton Federation of Community Leagues, and the City of Edmonton have a tripartite agreement, which dictates how the space at the community league and around the community league are managed. And in their section on maintenance, it says that the maintenance of flower beds, sorry, it says that it is the responsibility of the league to maintain all of the landscaping that includes things like line trimming, weed whacking, edging, planting, and flower beds and shrub beds. And so if we call this thing a shrub bed, not a forest, not a tree, then that would allow leagues to put together a little nursery on the land that they manage and essentially have control over it. So they would be responsible for essentially maintaining it. The other nice thing about this is that this was built just directly on top of the soil, so it didn't require any digging. Um, the whole thing cost about 50, $60 in materials and is a way of growing lots of little trees and letting them get established before then going and dispersing them throughout the community. And we'll talk about those little options. Now, every single community has a different boundary, and so that is something that the Edmonton Federation of Community Leagues can help pull up. This is one that Aaron pulled up for me earlier today. So this is North Glenora. And we can see here in the green area, this is essentially the league land. And so any of the, flower beds, shrub beds in that dotted blue area would be under, would be like it would be the league that would be required to maintain them. So in theory, placing a small nursery somewhere in that dotted space um, would be doable. Ideally, most of these trees, especially bristlecone pine, like they're a high alpine plant, so they're used to full sunlight. So full sun would be ideal. Depending on how we kind of proceed, there's a chance that maybe a lot of those trees get pulled out as they get larger, and we are left with one large tree. And maybe at some point in the future, when it's large enough, the city could actually move it, which would or could involve bringing in an air spade. Sorry, not an air spade, but a tree spade to pull out the tree. So the city's suggesting actually being 3 meters from utilities or structures. And so doing an Alberta One call, even though we're not digging, would be useful in the event that there's any digging down the line, or if there is any work that needs to be done on those utilities while those trees are growing out. Um, oops. Oh, I hit the link. There we go. And so that is kind of the workaround that we're thinking. Instead of planting a tree, it would actually be in like a 2 foot by 2 foot nursery bed, propagating a handful of trees that could grow out until they reach a little bit of size. And then they could be one distributed through the community, so end up in the yards of residents, or two, continue to grow out either on site or off site until they're mature enough that they can be planted on city land. One of the things that we're hoping, or that we would really love, is for each community league who wants to participate to actually designate a tree steward. So the idea with a tree steward, which is still something that we're figuring out a little bit, is that you would have like a dedicated person on site that would help. Oops, that would help manage the trees. So taking care of the trees, peeking in on them, making sure that they're not being overtaken by weeds. Remember, they're only, they're pretty small. Watering them in the case of drought, though these are fairly drought tolerant trees in the case of uh, bristlecone pine. Doing an annual check-in with the LongTree Society, just saying, hey, here's how their trees are doing. Maybe we lost one this year. Asking any advice so we can help support that. Collecting artifacts. So if there are pictures of the trees, or maybe somebody wants to write a story or do some poetry or write a song, collecting those artifacts, encouraging any kind of community activities around it, suggesting just kind of like how we can improve the process, what's working at the community level, what's not. And then of course, I think when we're talking about growing something that is going to live ideally for 1,000+ years, helping create, like a bit of a succession plan. So we are imagining as a group a situation where a tree always has a tree steward attached to it. So in the case here, the nursery would have a tree steward. And so one of the roles of that steward would be when can no longer be the steward to actually help find their replacement who can then pick up that role. And so that's a bit of that relay and that baton. And so we'll see if we can get as best as possible that unbroken chain from generation to generation as these plants grow. The nurseries themselves are very easy to build, very inexpensive. So this is being a little bit I'm being kind of conservative with this, but it was about I think I paid $22 for a piece of cedar. I think I paid $8 for the hardware galvanized bolts. I think I paid $20 for some soil. I brought a little bit of mulch, and the seedlings and seeds would be provided by the LongTree Society. And there's been some talk right now about signage and what that might look like. There's talk about maybe placing it on the edge of the little nursery itself. Um, so just kind of so there would be a little bit of a cost of just kind of setting this up. That could be something that maybe could be taken up by sponsorship. I think the Longtree Society would be willing to subsidize leagues who are maybe having a little bit of a challenge scraping together some resources. Aaron suggested that this is appropriate for a neighborhood's micro grant, especially especially if there was going to be, say, like a planting party or building party, as was the case with, with our little planting party here. So here's us building one of these little nurseries. It's fairly simple. We just ended up putting it on the lawn. So we had a piece of cardboard to kill the lawn. We have our cedar bed. We have some soil. We have our seedlings and or seeds direct planted or direct sowed into the soil, and then a little bit of mulch on top just to keep just to conserve a little bit of moisture. It has been suggested that a ceremony or a celebration could accompany the building of the raised bed and the planting of the little trees. So it's kind of like marking off a 1,000-year project. I personally love the idea of collecting letters to the future or hopes and wishes for the trees to kind of send them off in the future. And I think that those are things that could be collected and could be recorded and preserved. It's weird, like I've been studying in cataloging heritage trees in the city of Edmonton for oh geez, like kind of casually for the better part of a decade. And the trees we love the most tend to be the trees that are connected to people and to places and have stories. And so there's an interesting thing here that we're kind of working from the other end. We're starting day one planting the tree and we're saying, okay, what kinds of stories are we going to attach to these? What kinds of connections to the people in the community are we going to attach to these little plants? And so I don't think I have an answer here, and I don't think that it would be our job to say you have to do X. But we love the idea of each community league trying to come up with a way of celebrating their little trees and collecting their stories, because I think it's those kinds of things ultimately that end up protecting those trees and that differentiate it from, say, one tree growing in the park versus another. Um, this is now these little trees here, these are some of the ones that we direct sowed into this. In a couple weeks after they germinate, you just get the tiniest little tuft. These trees are a few months old. But they are slow growing. And so you can grow a lot of them in this 2 by 2 foot little nursery here. And naturally, you'll eventually, you're likely going to lose a couple over time. But the goal here would be to grow a tiny little forest in this 2 by 2 space that can then be distributed into their forever homes. And so, did I misspell that? And so the idea is the nursery would be installed, and as the trees kind of get about 6 inches tall, A lot of them can be distributed to members of the community and say planted in private yards throughout the neighborhood. And a handful of trees or a single tree could continue to live in the nursery until it reaches a size in which it's suitable to plant on city land. And so this is a tree that is 5 years old, grown from seed, and this tree ended up over at Nate. And so that's an idea of how slow growing these trees are. And so planting that nursery, cultivating those trees, getting them to kind of that like 6 inches high, and then distributing a lot of those into the community, leaving, one or two trees left that could then eventually end up planted in public spaces. And so this is kind of, to use North Glenora as an example, 5, 10 years from now, you take a lot of those trees in that little nursery, and a lot of the people that have been involved in the project, maybe they're interested in planting trees in their own yards. And now we have kind of a little long tree explosion and trees dotted throughout the community where they will hopefully, still be able to grow for that 1,000 years. The idea here, I think, is to go from, one tree steward who is going to be helping manage, this single bed. And then every time a tree is pulled and planted in a yard somewhere, each tree is going to be stewarded by the person who planted it, which obviously is going to be an interesting experiment because, the trees are going to live older than the stewards themselves. And so how do you pass that on to the next person or the next homeowner? And will these trees all live to 1,000? Almost certainly not. We've often joked that worst case scenario, we catalog 1,000 ways to kill a tree in Edmonton. That's a really bleak scenario. I don't think we'll I don't think that will be the final result, but that's still useful information of where a tree's surviving, under what conditions are they surviving, under what soil are they surviving, how are like under what conditions can a tree survive development, as an example. And then, if we can gather enough of that data over time, we can actually use that to better inform the planting of not just long trees in the future, but all trees in the future. The idea is that some of these trees could stay back in the little nursery bed and allowed to mature. And so, 2.5 meters is going to be a little bit of a wait for a bristlecone pine, but maybe a few decades later, we've got a tree that is, that's ready to be planted in a permanent site. Maybe the site that it is in is totally suitable and the tree doesn't need to move. Um, or more likely, the city would we could actually work with the city, and there are some mechanisms for doing this to plant that tree on public land or in that kind of league space there. Now, as soon as we plant a tree, the rules are a little bit different. So going back to the tripartite agreement, so trees that are planted at league sites um, are the absolute property of the city upon final acceptance. And so trees that get planted on public land uh, need to be in good health. They need to, for conifers, 2.5 meters tall. And if they meet those requirements, they then, once established, will get pulled into the city's inventory and then will become part of the city's sort of responsibility to maintain it. And so, but that's kind of how we can get trees in public spaces eventually, because these tiny little trees are just, they're too small to be able to do it. Now, I'm glossing over a lot of kind of nuance in this, and so I think Yolanda, when we do some questions, will be able to provide some of that nuance. We also have a planning document that we keep working on and revising that we'll be able to share a little bit more of that those details in there. And so, but the idea is that most of these trees will disperse throughout the neighborhood and be planted on private land where we don't need permission. Um, and some of these trees could be let to grow, even potentially off-site. Um, some of the conversations with the city has suggested that it might be possible to take some of these trees that have been started at community leagues, pull them off-site, grow them until until they've reached that maturity, and then bring them back and plant them into public spaces, either at this community or in a further in a different community. So that's kind of the gist of my sort of fumbly presentation and the process that we've kind of been like trying to streamline and identify. Um, the thing that would be needed now, if you're so interested in getting involved in the project. For starters, any individual who's just like, yeah, I want to be part of these weird conversations and I'm interested in being a member of the LongTree Society. If you go to longtrees.org, there's a link in there. You can come, you can hang out with us as much as you want. We would love to have you. If you're interested in doing this at your community league, or at your community garden, that's something that I kind of glossed over too. It is likely very possible to repeat this to do the same process at community gardens. What you would want is basically a board motion to say yes, we're involved. You'd want to say who your long tree steward is, so like an individual who is keen and saying yes, this is a thing that I want to do. And then if we've got those two things, we can start, helping you collect or purchase the nursery material. We can provide seeds and little seedlings. We love the idea of doing a little planting party, construction party celebration that we can do to um, while these trees go in. And right now we're having some conversations with some local manufacturers about what a plaque could look like. So I'm going to stop this here because I feel like I've talked way too much and I want to get to questions.